All right. Well, sorry to be a minute late, but that's okay. Where else are we going to go? Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our briefing about the 2026 Sustainable Energy in America Factbook. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. I'd like to start with a couple words of thanks, starting with Representative Paul Tonko for his help with the room today. I'd also like to say thanks to the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Caucuses of the Senate and the House. On the Senate, that's chaired by Senators Crapo and Reed and Collins and Van Hollen. And on the House side, Mr. Cleaver from Representative Emmanuel Cleaver. I'd also like to give a special shout out to our friends at the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition for working with us to bring you this briefing and also to help to get the word out today. This briefing would absolutely not be possible without the partnership of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. So major thanks to Lisa, of course, but also to Emmy and to Lizzie and to Ruth and to Laura and everyone in the BCSE team for helping us bring all of this together. And of course, we have to also thank everyone at BloombergNEF who once again put together a really, really great resource. For more than 40 years, EESI has brought nonpartisan science-based information to Capitol Hill. We were founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we've worked to provide science-based information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. Our work is always focused on the multiple benefits of these solutions, like energy affordability and better economic outcomes, enhanced grid resilience and readiness, and improved national security and international competitiveness for U.S. companies. What does our work look like? Well, it looks like this. We do lots and lots of briefings. Next week, we'll be over in the Russell building for a briefing about wildfire resilience with our friends at the Federation of American Scientists. We'll also have a reception after that briefing, so if you need a little bit of extra impetus to get over there, that will be a really good briefing. On March 12th, we will have a fantastic panel up here to talk about the real-world benefits of energy efficiency that households and small businesses can rely on to combat rising electricity prices. We have a lot more than that, too much to go through. Everything is always available on our website, which is eesi.org. And the best way to keep up with what we do is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. We try really hard to make sure that we're timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. This briefing meets all of those, no questions. We put a lot of thought to make sure into making sure that our resources are always ready when congressional staff need the information. It's much better to know where to go before your boss asks the tough questions than after, and you can count on us to help with that. Every year, we organize a briefing about the Factbook because it is a tremendously valuable resource. This briefing is one where I know I'm just going to learn stuff today that I'm going to use every day for the next year. It's that good. I encourage you to download it, visit the Business Council online. The slides are also that will be presented are also on the front table. It's thoroughly organized. It is chock full of data points and trends that will help you make sense of how the U.S. energy system is evolving, what the drivers of this evolution are, and what policy options could encourage it to evolve even further. Lastly, we have a survey. We'll bring this link back up at the end of the briefing as well. If you have a moment to take our survey, we'd really appreciate that. We have some new questions, and we read every response, and it's a great deal great help to us as we put our programming together. We will also, after our final speaker today, have time for Q&A. We will be taking online questions. You can follow us on social media at EESI Online. You can also send us an email. The email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. And of course, we'll have a roving microphone for folks in the room brave enough to ask questions because we're going to learn a ton, and I'm sure there'll be lots of great conversation that we'll want to dig into that Q&A. Because we have so many panelists, we're going to be using abbreviated introductions today. But if you'd like to learn more about any of them, there are bios as well as the slides at the check-in table that you walked past when you came into the room. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Lisa Jacobson. Lisa is the president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and she will be our guide for the next hour-ish as we move through the great resource that is the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook. Thanks, Lisa.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thanks to the entire, let's give them a round of applause. Thanks to the entire EESI team. I mean, really just tremendous job, and you really are a valuable resource and very unique resource for Congress. So we appreciate that tremendously and benefit from all the excellent work you do. For those that are not familiar with the Business Council, BCSE is a coalition of companies and trade associations representing a diverse portfolio of energy resources. We span energy efficiency, natural gas, renewable energy, energy storage, sustainable transportation, and a suite of decarbonization technologies. We're also proud to have under our banner Clean Energy Business Network, which is over 8,000 clean energy business leaders from around the country representing small and medium-sized entrepreneurs and innovators around the country. Founded in 1992, the Business Council is focused on education and advocacy, and we do work extensively with Congress. And we're very pleased to be able to share the 2026 Sustainable Energy in America Factbook with all of you. And just like Dan, I learn every time I hear the findings of the Factbook, and I really do find it a tremendous resource. So thank you for your time. And BCSE is happy also to follow up with you if you have any questions. We couldn't do the Factbook without our sponsors, so I definitely want to acknowledge all of them. And maybe just share very briefly a few points before I introduce our speakers today. The Factbook is meant to be quantitative and timely. Energy markets are changing very rapidly, and it's often the case we do not have up-to-date market information, and we do not always have it put together. And I think the Factbook does a great service by knitting together lots of different trends in the energy sector in one resource. When I look at 2025, and the data in the Factbook goes through, in many cases, the end of 2025, but it also shares some longer-term trends, I hear loud and clear, we need more energy now. We need supply-side resources, we need demand-side resources, we need them to be coordinated and executed and implemented together. This is critical for our national security. It's critical for our environment. It's critical for households and businesses that want to keep driving U.S. economic prosperity. So when we think about the things that the Factbook is telling us from a policy perspective, I wanted to share just 3 buckets with you, things that are top of mind for Business Council for Sustainable Energy members as we think about this last session of this Congress. First, the need for permitting and siting reform. We need to move to a posture in the United States where we can build things quickly. And the energy sector is a driver of all economic activity, but also the energy sector in particular needs some regulatory reforms and leadership from Congress, and appreciate the bipartisan conversations that Congress is having on this important topic. The second is continued investment in our energy system, and this is natural gas as well as electric grid infrastructure and modernization. We need to be looking there too at opportunities to do this more quickly, but to take advantage of new technologies that can really optimize our energy system. So encourage and appreciate all the work that Congress is doing in that area. Finally, tied to that is the U.S. is a global innovation leader. And Congress has a big role to play in making sure there can be public-private investments to innovate and to invest in new technologies that we will need just to keep energy affordable, reliable, safe, and clean. And at the conclusion, I would say, this is critical from a national security perspective, and it's also critical from a customer choice perspective. So thank you for spending some time with us today. I know you'll learn a lot, as will I, and I really look forward to the discussion that will follow. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce the Business Council for Sustainable Energy's chair, Allison Hull, to make some welcoming remarks. Thanks for being with us, Allison.
Thank you, Lisa. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Very proud as the chairman of the Business Council to be able to be here, and I'm so proud of the coalition that produced this one-of-a-kind resource. It was about 14 years ago when the Business Council and our partners realized that there was a transformation underway, but there really weren't the resources that had the facts out there to support it. And so that's how we came up with the Factbook, not me personally, as a coalition, as a group, as a partnership. And that partnership's continued with BloombergNEF all these years. And that's what gets me excited when I look at the Factbook, and particularly when I looked at this year, where my day job is with Sempra, which is utility company. Basically, we've got San Diego Gas and Electric in California, as well as SoCal Gas. We've got about 22 million customers between those two gas and electric utilities. And we're out here, we're on the Hill talking to you guys, and we're telling you these things about energy growth and, lack of supply and data centers and all of that. And it's really nice to have the fact book as a backup to be like, this is not just Allison at Sempra telling you this. There's actual facts to back it up. And I personally find that super helpful. As one of the largest owners of one of the largest energy networks in the continent, Sempra's focused on building America's leading utility growth business by investing in and modernizing our U.S. utilities that I just mentioned. And that's through investments like those highlighted in the fact book, whether it be natural gas, electric infrastructure, next-gen technology. Everything that we're doing, we're trying to strengthen resiliency, improve affordability, and serve our customers in the best way that we can. I feel like the data in the fact book really provides that foundation that policymakers need, that the industry needs, that the media needs to look at as we consider what we need to do to meet demand that we've been talking about in an affordable, efficient, and safe way. Thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks to all of you for being here.
Thank you, Allison. So what we're going to do now, we're very pleased to have with us Trina White, who is the Senior Associate at North American Energy Transition Business Group with BloombergNEF. She's going to walk through some of the top-level findings of the fact book, and then we're going to have a moderated discussion. But I will introduce our speakers for that moderated discussion after Trina's remarks. So Trina, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. If you haven't heard of BloombergNEF or BNEF, we're a research provider within the wider Bloomberg organization. We focus on the energy transition and decarbonization. We cover that across sectors from the supply side and the demand side. So when I say supply side, I basically mean all power generating technologies and commodities. On the demand side, transport and clean industry. We do that globally. My job is to look cross-sector for North America. So really a focus on the US and Canada. And the fact book is a really important part of kind of drawing that narrative together at a high level. There's no way that this fact book could be a one-person job. It's 80+ pages. It draws from the research across BNEF. It also draws from a lot of the data that gets provided by the members of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. So thank you so much, Lisa, for working closely with me and my colleagues over the past couple of months to put this together. And this is just a brief overview of some of the key findings, but you'll find that there's much more on specific topics if you dig through. So thematically, in terms of what we were kind of thinking we saw in 2025, it was a really challenging year, particularly from the policy perspective. A lot of turbulence for the sectors that we cover. And yet, even still, I think what you'll find in this fact book is that sustainable energy sources really were resilient and held their ground in 2025. There's a number of reasons for that. First, I want to start with the build and the new activity that we saw last year. So this is new U.S. electric generating capacity year on year. And you'll see that 2025 was the highest year for new capacity build since 2002. Increasingly, that new generating capacity is dominated by clean sources. So in 2025, the vast majority of this was solar, stationary storage, and wind. Solar additions actually went down slightly year on year. But what really sort of grew and is part of that growth narrative is stationary storage. Batteries have become increasingly cost competitive, particularly imported batteries. That deployment is really new in just the past few years. We didn't really see stationary storage at a utility scale start to take off until around 2021, 2022. So that's a huge part of the growth story. Also, gas new capacity grew significantly over 2024, but that's really because there was such a low baseline in the last couple of years. Gas costs have gone up significantly, particularly because of turbine constraints. And so we just saw 5 gigawatts of new utility scale gas generating capacity come online last year in 2025. If you take renewables and storage together, that made up over 90% of the new capacity additions last year. So why do we see increasing capacity additions year on year? Demand is going up. So probably most of you in this room are hearing a lot about electricity prices and growing load. Particularly, we'll talk, I promise, about data centers. But just at the high level, this is electricity demand from 2000. And you'll notice that for kind of throughout the 2010s, electricity demand was relatively flat, with some bumps, of course. But really, we're now starting to see a trend over the past couple of years of electricity demand rising again. There's a few ways that we can put that into context. One of my favorites, and BCSE focuses a lot on efficiency. So one of my favorite ways to put this into context is energy productivity, which is really putting energy consumption into the context of wider economic growth. So on the left, what you'll see is the growth in GDP over time relative to energy consumption. On the right, that's basically just dividing the two. So GDP in terms of quadrillion BTU of energy consumption, energy productivity, so how much we can generate in terms of GDP relative to how much energy is consumed, has consistently gone up over time. A lot of that has to do with efficiency gains. Now, in terms of what has made up the generation of that increasing energy demand, so meeting energy demand by the various sources of generation that we have in the US, that picture has changed also quite dramatically over time. A huge part of the story has been displacing coal power generation with cleaner sources of generation, and that includes gas. It also includes renewables. Nuclear has remained relatively steady. So the share of zero carbon electricity generation in 2025 was about 43% of total generation. So when I say zero carbon, I mean nuclear plus renewables made up 43%. Gas generated about 40% of electricity in 2025. Now, I do want to point out, because total electricity demand and electricity generation grew last year, even though the share of coal generation remained relatively level, ticked up slightly to about 16%, the total coal generation did grow about 13% year on year to 735 terawatt hours. That reflects the need to run existing coal plants more consistently to meet that increasing demand. We will see that show up later when we talk about emissions. There are a number of reasons that electricity demand and therefore generation have been increasing over the past few years. There's electrification, there's some onshoring of manufacturing, there's electric vehicles, which increase electricity demand. But the real story in the last couple of years has been the AI boom. And so, of course, that means data centers, and increasingly very large AI data centers. This is data center power demand broken down by the power grid region within the US over time from 2015 to 2025. You can see that total power demand from data centers has quintupled in the past decade. That's up about 20% year on year from 2024 to 2025. That growth has been dominated by what we call PJM, ERCOT, which is effectively Texas, and the Southeast. When I say PJM, that's the largest grid operator in the country. We're in PJM right now. That's about 13 states plus DC. We are very close to what we call Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia, where the vast majority of existing data center construction has taken place. This is nothing compared to the pipeline. So we focus the fact book on backwards looking information. We focus through 2025, but we at BNEF do a lot of forecasting, a lot of forward looking scenarios, and we track the pipeline of data center capacity that we see coming online. And a lot of what we're talking about, particularly from a political perspective, is what we see going forward. So about twice as much data center IT capacity is under construction or already committed or permitted. If we're talking about early stage announcements, that demand could be exponential. These are really power hungry assets. They want around the clock access to reliable electricity. There's a number of political considerations here around who bears the cost of meeting that increasing demand. That means both constraints on grid infrastructure as well as the need for more deployment of new generating capacity. I also noted that electricity demand is in part dependent on the deployment of electric vehicles on the demand side. And of course, this is also very important for decarbonizing the transportation sector. In 2025, we saw EV sales reach 1.6 million vehicles. That's a marginal increase over 2024, about 4%. That is mostly due to a spike in sales in the third quarter of 2025, right immediately prior to the repeal of the tax credit for purchasing new electric vehicles. So consumers rushed to purchase their vehicles while there was that incentive, and we saw that subsequent drop off in the fourth quarter of 2025. EV adoption, so the share of new vehicles that are electric or plug-in hybrid, remains around 10% of new vehicles sold. I don't want to gloss over the fact that this was a really difficult year for these sectors from a policy perspective. There were a number of hurdles, and I'll only really be able to go through a few, but I think the folks who are on the panel can talk about what this meant for decision-making last year. The first is on trade, particularly from a tariff perspective. Our analysts tracked around over 80 different policy changes to tariffs that affected clean technologies. So both raising and then also subsequently lowering tariff rates and trade barriers in 2025. So really what that meant for our sectors was constant change and difficulty planning. So both for companies and for investors to make decisions based on what they expected costs to look like in the future. This was especially true for batteries. So at one point, Chinese batteries hit a tariff rate of over 150% before ending the year back down at about 31%. As a result, we started to see some supply chain dependence shift away from China and to other trade partners like South Korea and throughout Southeast Asia. Of course, this story is still ongoing. The Factbook covers through 2025. We've seen so much change just in the past couple of weeks. Finally, a Supreme Court ruling on just some of those tariffs. We expect that the administration will try to fill in those gaps and increase tariff rates again. So again, difficulty in terms of planning ahead. Maybe one of the most important policy changes last year was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This table, I will not go through each line item, but effectively it is a list of a number of the different credits, incentives, sources of funding that were passed in 2022 under the Inflation Reduction Act. And on the right-hand side, what the sort of status is post the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was passed in July of this past year. A couple of important ones to call out. I mentioned the EV purchase tax credit expired already in the third quarter of 2025. The phase out for the production and investment tax credits for renewable energy are on a very accelerated phase out timeline beginning this year and next year. A number of these technologies are subject to increasingly stringent supply chain restrictions around materials and companies that are based in particularly China or other foreign entities of concern. And a number of these subsidies are partially or totally eliminated in terms of the unobligated funds. One example that I want to walk through, I mentioned the production and investment tax credits for clean energy. Even within just those couple of tax credits, this is really complicated. The timeline takes a lot of nuance to parse. And so companies are really trying to figure out ways in which they can claim the remaining tax credits. For wind and solar specifically, 100% of the tax credits remain if the projects either begin construction in the first half of this year or are placed in service before the end of 2027. It gets more complicated after that. Certain technologies fared much better. Energy storage, so batteries, and then what we tend to call firm generation, so nuclear, geothermal, hydropower, and bioenergy fared much better under the OBBA. 100% of the tax credit is available through 2034. But these technologies are also not immune to the supply chain restrictions. So those foreign entity of concern provisions that we just saw guidance passed a couple of weeks ago. Amid all of this picture of increasing electricity demand, policy hurdles, I think it's important to also retain kind of that big picture look on emissions and progress against climate goals, past and present. I've included here the baseline for the US under the Paris Agreement of 2005. Obviously, we are no longer a part of the Paris Agreement, but I think it's actually really interesting to see the progress that we have made in terms of total economy-wide emissions since 2005. We've seen emissions reduced about 15%. When you break that down by sector, so the primary sources of emissions in the US, you'll see that the power sector was really responsible for that decline in emissions. That's again the story that I mentioned earlier of coal generation giving way to gas and renewables. That power sector progress, so the consistent decline in emissions that we've seen since the peak of 2005, has now flatlined. So in the past couple of years, we've started to see emissions stemming from the power sector remain relatively flat and actually tick up just slightly in 2025. So going forward, from a climate perspective, and as we see electricity demand increase, it's important to remember that that's where we really saw gains on climate in the US and where attention will need to focus going forward, in addition to now the primary source of emissions in the US, which is transportation. At the beginning, I said sustainable energy did hold its ground in 2025 amid a really turbulent environment and a tough year for these sectors. I think that's in part because these sectors are more resilient and robust than they really ever were before. One of the ways that I like to talk about this is from a kind of core economics perspective and a cost lens. Demand is strong, and so are the core economics. These are our levelized costs of electricity for various sources of power generation in the US. We actually just put out the 2025 numbers last week. This is just benchmark costs for new build, life cycle costs on a megawatt hour basis by different technologies. And what you'll notice is that building new coal power generation is extremely expensive in the US. We benchmarked that at about $171 per megawatt hour, really high CapEx and OpEx, regulatory risk, stranded asset risk. Meanwhile, gas and renewables are comparably very, very cheap on a life cycle basis. Both solar and wind are now about $61 per megawatt hour, and also, I will note, faster to build in terms of lead time. Gas costs moved up a bit in 2025. I mentioned turbine constraints. A lot of that had to do with data centers trying to get their hands on an increasingly limited supply of gas turbines. Our gas LCOE was about $66 per megawatt hour in 2025. So that makes renewables, once again, slightly cheaper than new gas. There are a variety of ways that different technologies play a role within the power system. These are very different technologies that operate on different timelines. We kind of separate this in a simple way with intermittent sources. So that means they generate power when they're able, so when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing on the far left of this chart. Dispatchable technologies we display in the middle, and that's primarily coal and gas meant to run most of the time. Nuclear is comparably extremely expensive. And then flexibility providers. So for example, when we pair things like PV or wind with storage on the right-hand side. One more thing that makes me optimistic is when we look at investment in the energy transition. Investment did not grow significantly in 2025, but even despite all of these uncertainties from a policy perspective, we did not see investment crash. This is company and investor dollars being put on the line for renewables, for transport, for grid investment. And it's a more kind of forward-looking metric on where we're seeing dollars be sort of deployed for each of these sectors. And so, again, this held relatively steady last year. And with that, I would love to hear a lot more from the folks who are kind of practitioners and helping to deploy these technologies.
Thank you very much, Trina. That was an excellent overview. And now I'm going to introduce in turn each one of our speakers. And the first will be Charles Bolden, Senior Director for Congressional Affairs with the Solar Energy Industries Association. Next, after him, will be Charles Hernick, Head of Environmental Policy with Amazon. And next will be Sam Hodas, Vice President of U.S. Government Affairs for National Grid. Next will be Chris Young, Manager of Government Relations with Johnson Controls. Next will be Jack Thirolf, Head of Energy Policy for Net Power. And Christina Baworowsky, Senior Vice President for Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. It's really a powerhouse panel. I'm very eager to hear what their feedback is, and then we look forward to the conversation with all of you. So please, Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I first want to take the time to thank BCSE, EESI, and Bloomberg for this incredible report. I also want to thank Tyler Thompson, who is our research guru at SEIA, and my colleague Jonathan Ayahuasca, who is here in the crowd today. Today I'll be talking about slides 22 and 23, and so I want to begin with just saying renewables, solar in particular, our industry is still thriving with all the things that we've seen politically and legislatively. Renewable deployments were slightly down in 2025, but solar continued to show that it is the dominant form of new energy in the U.S. This chart shows that 36 gigawatts of utility scale solar were implemented last year, and with 11 gigawatts of rooftop solar as well, which made a total of 47 gigawatts installed last year. Even as policy changes and bureaucratic roadblocks have hampered growth in solar, it continues to project as the leading technology for current and future grid deployments. Solar's low cost and speed to deploy make it a key solution in a high load growth environment, and it will be key to meeting the challenges that the electricity grid faces in the near future. The increased role of solar has been crucial to grids across the country. Increased expansion of solar helped reduce price spikes in ERCOT throughout last summer amidst extreme weather and strained grid conditions. As we heard from Trina earlier, that remains true, and we are definitely the fastest to deploy, as well as the cheapest. The next slide. So this slide, I'll be talking about solar as leading the way, not only for renewable deployments, but for all energy deployments. Solar has represented the majority of new generating capacity brought online each of the last 3 years. This report shows 7 times more installation than all clean technologies combined. Improving economics and grid value of storage has also been crucial for renewable deployment. Storage made up about 25% of new capacity additions in 2025, which has brought more flexibility to the grid and increased the value of generation of renewables. However, we've saw a number of permitting challenges in 2025, which caused and continue to cause project delays and uncertainty for developers. While most projects that came online last year already had their permits secured prior to the Department of Interior's July 15th memo, the lack of permitting policy clarity could hinder deployments in the near future in 2026 and especially 2027. In addition, recent fiat guidance has left many questions unanswered, furthering the uncertainty developers face. Increased policy stability and further clarity around OB3 implementation will allow the industry to continue to grow and supply low-cost power to the grid at the time when electrons become more and more valuable. And that is my portion of the slide. So Charles, you take it away.
I'm delighted to follow another Charles.
Likewise.
This never happens. This never happens. So Charles Hernick, I lead energy and environmental policy for Amazon, and thanks to EESI and BCSE for pulling this together. And I want to pick up because Trina in the presentation, you see the numbers going up. You see demand really increasing in the energy sector. You see supply also increasing. And we go back to like economics 101, and that means that prices should probably stay about the same. But what we're seeing in this slide here is that they're not. Energy prices are increasing. Data centers have been mentioned a couple of times already. And for Amazon, this is front and center of mind for us, not just as a builder of data centers nationwide and globally, but also as a diversified company that buys a lot of energy for our other, for our other businesses, for our customers. For me as an individual, I'm outraged. My utility bill went up 25% over the last year. And I'm like channeling way more of my father than I ever thought I would, yelling at my children to turn off the lights when I know full well it's actually my electric vehicle that's driving the charge. But that's beside the point, because we've been in this era of unprecedented inflation and everybody's tired of it. And then finally, the electricity bills have come up. And so this is really worth inspecting. And from an affordability standpoint, we do need to dive in on this. Data centers are unquestionably part of the demand surge. And we view this as a really important and good thing. We are not just building data centers for the fun of it. Data centers are the backbone of the modern American economy and the future economy. We provide data services to the U.S. federal government, the Department of War, intelligence agencies, large businesses. If you're streaming, at the end of the day to just unwind, you're likely streaming from a cloud services provider, and that may be Amazon. But we're getting, so much of our day-to-day lives depends on high-speed internet and access to compute. And right now, the biggest driver that we're still seeing, the talk is about AI, but another major driver is still just conventional compute moving to the cloud. The data that we see is that there's still like only 30% of all compute has moved to the cloud. So when we see these projections like going into the future, there's a lot more data that needs to move for ease of analytics and cost and efficiency move to the cloud. And from a carbon footprint, when businesses are able to move their compute to the cloud, they can reduce the total carbon footprint of their enterprise, that is their work that is being done. They can reduce that carbon footprint by 99%. So from an efficiency standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from a cost standpoint, there's all these reasons to move to the cloud. So that's why we're continuing to build, continuing to invest. But the impact on cost is really something that we are worried about. And when we look at it and when we study what is driving, rate increases, a key factor is actually the age of existing infrastructure that's out there. We're needing to modernize so much of the electric grid, bring on additional resources. And maybe we can switch to the next slide, which shows Amazon's continued build and our interest to increase supply. And for 5 years in a row, we were delighted to say that Amazon was the world's largest corporate purchaser of renewable energy. And we did that 5 years in a row. And suddenly we're not on top, but in the spirit of competition, like even U.S. Olympic hockey teams let it go by every once in a while. So we'll let this one by. But we're still quite proud of the investments that we're making. Over the course of the past decade alone, we've invested and built over 250 projects in the United States. That's over 20 gigawatts of power. That 20 doesn't mean a lot to me, but that's enough to power New York City twice. It's enough to power the state of Georgia. We're talking about a lot of electricity that Amazon has brought online. So yes, we are going to continue to build and we need to meet demand for data centers. We're also going to continue to build supply and make investments on that side. And that's where maybe we'll get to the policy conversation on how we can bridge the gap on what's slowing things down in the middle. But in the interest of time, I'll maybe stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to the Charleses. I'm gonna pivot a little bit, talking about two very related topics and two areas where National Grid, where electric and gas utility in New York and Massachusetts spend a lot of time playing, which is venture capital and climate tech, as well as grid enhancing technologies. So when we look at the data that Bloomberg NEF has pulled together, what we see is that after fairly dramatic growth in the VC and PE space, there was a bit of a pullback following 2022, and then a bit of a stabilization. That happened, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. That happened in the context of a broader pullback in PE and VC investment nationwide, not specific necessarily just to this sector. But as things have stabilized and continued on from 2023 through 2025, what we have seen here is obviously a sharp increase in clean power investments and a decrease in energy storage. At the same time, in a bit of a disappointment to us, we've seen Massachusetts fall off its lead as a state, driving and pulling in lots of clean tech investment, only to be displaced by Texas, of all places, which is seeing a substantial amount of investment in, of all things, clean energy technology. One of the big trends that we see at National Grid and at our venture capital arm, National Grid Partners, is that while clean energy and clean power are obviously continuing to drive quite a bit and a growing chunk of all of the VC investment that's happening nationwide, all of the same trends that we're all experiencing and contending with that Charles just described, Charles Hernick, not Charles Bolden, require a substantial amount of investment across the energy ecosystem. So while National Grid, as a electric distribution company, is utilizing these technologies, National Grid Partners, our venture capital arm that's invested in over 50 different companies at the current moment, is looking at what are the innovations that are going to allow us to be more flexible, more dynamic, more affordable, more resilient over time as we now are deep into a period of unprecedented load growth after decades, frankly, of fairly flat load growth that we were able to manage with lots of our BCSE partners through energy efficiency and minimum build out of new generation. So when you think about what the different types of technologies are that VCs are investing in that we're able to take advantage of, BloombergNEF does a good job of compiling the data here on slide 54. The biggest and most accelerated place where we've seen the build out has been around reconductoring and dynamic line rating. So those are taking the lines, modernizing them, using newer technologies, newer materials, so you can get more out of the same, effectively, linear distance. And you can be much more adaptable with where the power is flowing into whom. For a long time, I feel like there wasn't necessarily a bipartisan consensus around the need for GETs or grid enhancing technologies. But what we've seen with this massive build out of new load, new demand, is that there's a growing consensus that to meet this in a way that's going to be affordable and flexible for individuals is going to require some front end investments in the types of technologies that are going to take better advantage of distributed energy resources, ensure that as we have new load that comes on that's able to bring some of its own power and provide some demand response flexibility, you're going to need more advanced conductoring, more edge computing. So the trends we're seeing in both the GETs and the venture capital space is exactly that. Clean energy is continuing to grow, but at the same time, we're doing quite a bit more and expect to continue to see quite a bit more as it relates to things that can provide more adaptability and resilience within the system.
Thanks, Sam. And thanks to everyone for being here today, and thanks to our organizers for setting this up. So Chris Young, I represent Johnson Controls. We're a 140-year-old buildings technology company, and we have 31,000 employees across the United States, and we have a footprint in every state. And our technologies allow buildings and all kinds of critical environments to be healthy, safe, and efficient. So think heating and ventilation and air conditioning systems for big buildings like airports and schools and hospitals. We also provide security systems of all kinds and fire detection and suppression systems for those kinds of facilities too. And we're increasingly focused on providing those kinds of solutions for critical environments. So spaces that need really tightly controlled temperature and pressure and other conditions. So think research facilities, operating rooms, chip manufacturing facilities. And we're also a world leader in data center cooling technologies, and that's certainly relevant to today's discussion. But the slide that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is focused on building energy codes and performance standards. And, these are just to set the table a little bit. These are really important to the broader conversation we're having because residential and commercial buildings together are responsible for about 35% of total energy usage in the country, and that includes direct energy usage and electricity consumption. And building energy codes, these are minimum efficiency standards for new and renovated residential and commercial buildings. And they set requirements for things like insulation and HVAC systems and lighting, all things geared to reduce overall energy consumption. And there are different codes for residential and commercial buildings, as you might imagine. And ASHRAE is the standard setting body that sets those codes for commercial buildings. And then the IECC sets them for residential buildings, but they also do a little bit of both. And really worth highlighting that those two organizations, ASHRAE and IECC, these are really respected engineering-focused standard-setting bodies that account for technological developments over time, and they take those developments into account when they're developing these new codes. So most states right now have adopted these codes on a statewide basis, and then those that don't leave it up to individual municipalities to vote to adopt those. And these codes are typically updated every 3 years by those standard setting bodies, but then it takes time and it's voluntary. It's up to the states to vote to adopt those. And one thing that I have on the slide in front of me, I'm not sure that it's on this one, but a really important point to highlight is that each time these codes are updated, again, that's about every 3 years, they're producing energy efficiency gains in the ballpark of 10%. So, over decades, that results in some very significant energy savings. And, a really cool example of that, the ASHRAE building codes for commercial buildings between 1999 and 2019, they've become about 150% more energy efficient. So very significant in terms of energy savings. So about 20 states have adopted these newer 2019 ASHRAE codes. Again, those are for commercial buildings. And about 25 have adopted the IECC codes for residential buildings. So that highlights some, important advancements. There are a lot of states that have these newer, more efficient codes adopted, but it also highlights that there's a lot of room for improvement for more states, municipalities to adopt these more energy efficient codes and save a lot of energy. And just to really quickly note on the building performance standards, these codes, those apply to new buildings and large renovations, and performance standards are more geared towards existing large buildings. A handful of states, have and enforce these performance standards, and about 50 cities overall have and enforce these as well. But there are many others that are currently considering and are expected to adopt. So I'll stop there for today, but certainly welcome talking more during the discussion portion.
Thank you very much. I'm Jack Thirolf. I head up energy policy for a company called Net Power. 14 years ago, when the first Factbook was coming out, I was a policy associate at the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. So I want to say thank you to BCSE for having me here and for giving me my start in life, really. It's amazing how far you can come from being in the exact same place after 17 years. So Net Power, we are a technology and product development company with the mission of transforming natural gas into the lowest cost form of clean, firm power. We do that by building gas power plants that capture the emissions and then permanently sequestering those emissions underground. Clean, firm power, I think, is one of the buzzwords of 2025, and for good reason. There was a great report that came out last week, in addition to the Business Council for Sustainable Energy Factbook, from Clean Air Task Force, really looking at what's the value proposition for clean, firm power. Our mission and our point is do all the good things that natural gas power plants do on the grid today in terms of providing reliability, helping integrate variable resources like wind and solar, but do it while maximizing the reduction in pollution. That's the point of Clean Firm, to reduce the emissions from a specific power plant, and then also to help catalyze a broader grid. And if you look at the Clean Air Task Force paper, they do a great job of describing how sprinkling in a handful of Clean Firm power plants helps you deploy wind and solar, decarbonize the grid at much lower overall cost, so that you're not just looking at LCOE of one plant versus another, but from a system-wise basis. That's the point for Clean Firm power. And we're seeing that really markedly in 2025 in terms of customer demand. If you look at this graph, this isn't like a happy story for CCS in 2025, but it is showing the need and the promise going to 2035. That's going to happen because of the demand signals sent this past year. And I would call your attention to not just the, like every week there's a Clean Firm announcement from Amazon or others making commitments to different technologies. Google signed the first contract, not with us, but with another lovely company, a competitor, for offtake for power from a power plant using natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. In announcing that project, they also announced a new methodology for an energy attribute certificate for natural gas with CCS. If you're familiar with renewables, you know RECs. Those are the credits that give you the legal right to claim the environmental attributes of the energy production. There's been a big effort to do that for gas with CCS, which did not exist before. That's both a sign of customer demand and also something that helps unlock customer demand, particularly for those who want to match their electricity consumption to hourly production of energy and geographic deliverability. And we think those are places where natural gas with CCS is going to have its first big market opportunity. And that's where you get to that much bigger bar graph on the right. We are working on the first 80 megawatts that we think will come online end of 28, start of 29. That will be the first bit of that little blue in the Permian Basin in Texas. And that's a great segue to the next slide, which is a map, which are always fun. And want to point to the places where there's existing CO2 sequestration, where there are applications underway. I know we'll talk about policy in a little bit. There's a big push for the federal government to do a quicker, more efficient job in permitting carbon capture and sequestration, and then also partnering with states where they can have what's called primacy, which is regulatory authority over siting carbon capture and sequestration within their own state boundaries. We're seeing more states want that and get that in the past few years. And as the last point, I want to flag, if you look at the CO2 pipelines that exist on this map, those are pipelines that are bringing carbon dioxide across state lines. Those are primarily to serve what's called enhanced oil recovery. That's CO2 that is being used, that's naturally occurring, and is being piped mostly into West Texas and to eastern New Mexico, being permanently sequestered underground and used to produce additional oil in existing oil fields. We think there's a big opportunity to stop using or to reduce the amount of using of natural CO2 and to replace that with CO2 that's being produced through power plants that are helping meet data center and other growing demand. And that will have a, let's say, we'll have like an improved environmental situation for that production. So that's what those pipelines are for. And there was a briefing at the end of December from the Carbon Utilization Research Council talking about that specifically. We think that if 2025 was the year where people are really focused on Clean Firm, we think 26, 27, we're going to be talking about carbon capture and sequestration, doing permanent sequestration through enhanced oil recovery.
Fantastic. And because I'm the last panelist, I'll try to be a little bit condensed on going through this slide. My name is Christina Baworowsky. I'm Senior Vice President at CRESS. CRESS is a right-of-center organization, and we promote an all-of-the-above strategy to energy. What's right in Arizona might not be right in the Northeast, might not be right in Alaska, or might not be right in the Southwest. And we really do need all of these different types of generation in order to keep the lights on, ensure affordability, and also maintain America's economic competitiveness. So I kind of want to put a little bit of a personal spin on this slide because I've had the pleasure in my career to essentially work and touch almost every single one of these industries from either an electricity perspective, from a manufacturer perspective, or from being, I literally started my career in nuclear, so I joke everything else is easy. In 2013, when we were looking at what resources were available, we thought that we were going to run out of oil. We didn't have the benefit of a fracking boom yet. And so you see in 2013, we have almost 39% of our power is coming from coal. And we have about 19% from nuclear. But then we had this advent with natural gas. And you're going to see how between 2015, 2017, natural gas is just getting a bigger and bigger share. And then let's turn to like 2023-ish. We start seeing renewables go from 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 26%. And that's because we started seeing innovations come into market and drive down cost. They became very easy to scale. They became very easy to build. Nuclear is pretty much consistent. It's actually went up, just a little bit this year. But it's consistent because these are very large assets. We're not able to build them very quickly, and they're base load, they're clean firm, but they're very consistent. But we see the natural gas and the amount that we are making just slowly kind of eat up the portions that were originally coal back in 2013. But what we saw between 2024 and 2025 is that shift from 43% to 40% between the natural gas portfolio kind of being absorbed by renewables. It wasn't like clean coal came back. What happened was you got the renewables to a place where they were economically competitive and they were quick to dispatch. They, are projects that are just a lot faster. So one of the notable things about this slide is that, the amount of electricity coming from coal is up, but that's because we're struggling with essentially, the baseload side of things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when we are looking to the future, we're taking anything off of this chart. We're going to probably need to maintain most of the assets that we have, but we have opportunities there. We can do upgrades, we can do uprates, we can reopen, sunsetted nuclear power plants like Palisades, for example. We can build new nuclear facilities. We can deploy technologies like CCS so that the fossil fuels are indeed cleaner and more efficient. But it's important to note that we're probably going to be keeping all of these different types of generation. But the exciting thing is we have innovations that are going to make it cleaner, more reliable, more affordable. And so that's why things like permitting reform are constantly talked to by industry. But it's also why stable policies for businesses that encourage certainty are so critical. Because in order for us to kind of invest for that hyperscaler future that we've been hearing about quite a lot today, we're going to need a lot of money to put a lot of megawatts into our generation. But the great thing is we have such cool technology we can deploy. We know how to deploy it incredibly well. We just have to make it so that it's a lot easier for us to do it. Because in 2013, we thought we were going to run out of a lot of things, and it's 2025, and I actually feel very optimistic that with innovation, we can meet that need that we're seeing in the future.
Let me just thank all of the panelists. As our moderator, Dan Brissett comes to the podium. Let's give him a round of applause.
Standing this close to two Charleses is like, I'm getting the willies. This was a great panel. That was a really excellent set of presentations. Thank you so much. And Trina, thank you so much for walking us through so much information. Like literally, I will use that. I'm trying to lock as much of it away. You actually are holding a fact book. I know there aren't as many of these to give out, but that's a lot of information in a really nice resource that fits really nicely on your desk. Now you can download it as well, so you can search it and stuff, but it's a great resource. So let's get into some questions. We're absolutely going to take questions from the audience, and one of my colleagues somewhere has, it looks like Andy is getting the microphone, and we'll be happy to bring it around to you. But to kick us off, this is something that came up a couple different times, and that is sort of questions of policy, which is of interest to this audience as well. Maybe what we could do is let this side of the table go first. Maybe we could start with this Charles and then go down through the line, and then we would give Trina and Allison and Lisa a chance to weigh in as well. But what are some policies, Charles, or other key drivers that you would like to highlight for this audience as especially critical and important for Congress to stay focused on? Let's just not say this year because it's going to be a short year, this year, next year, maybe the year after that.
Absolutely. I would say the number one priority is permitting reform. The second, and I think most critical to the infrastructure of the United States, would be transmission and grid upgrades. So transmission legislation along with storage legislation. I think those are the three things that I would say are priorities.
Charles, number two.
Exactly what Charles said. But seriously, exactly what Charles said. We need permitting reform, and specifically, we need a transmission title in a permitting reform bill. So congratulations to the House side over here for getting the SPEED Act through. It was big deal, great momentum. We need to see the Senate continue to pick up where the House left off and build off of that with a specific transmission title. To add something new to what Charles said, I share Christina's optimism on innovation, and particularly for Amazon. Nuclear power is an area like the renewables was a part of the story that we've shared and we've made major investments in over the past decade. But looking forward, we have a lot of optimism for nuclear power. We made a $500 million investment in X Energy to help them hire people and get through the red tape to actually build and deploy nuclear power. So the help from a policy standpoint would be from that regulatory approvals standpoint to make sure that businesses have certainty to be able to move and deploy quickly. We've seen a lot of administrative action and interest, but to make those efforts permanent and to really find homes for nuclear power across the United States is going to be really critical, and Congress can play a great role in that.
Thanks. Sam?
I'm also going to say permitting reform, specifically with the transmission title. We have to be able to build more transmission in this country. We have to be able to quickly and efficiently get the lowest cost electron to the people who need it. And we need to do more to empower FERC to ensure that they're able to work with the different regional transmission organizations to design and come up with plans that can then be implemented and actually built out.
Chris?
Yeah, so I think pretty unanimous support for, a lot of the things that help with, generation like permitting reform. But one thing I would, like to plug, energy efficiency being a big part of the equation. So while we have, permitting reform helping with the generation, we also need to, I think, try to incentivize ways to, be better stewards of the energy that's, it's already being generated. It's going to take, some time for, new generation to come online. And there are, a lot of, I think, really effective bipartisan solutions that are already out there to, encourage energy efficiency in the commercial, residential, and the industrial sectors. There are some, unfortunately, a couple of those policies were listed in the slide earlier, but there are, still some really energy saving performance contracts, really successful policies like that I think could be utilized to help a lot there.
Everyone said all the smart things already, but I'll say our main ask is stability, which maybe seem modest, but I think is actually quite a dramatic thing to expect or to need. And then I would turn it, I think our biggest opportunities or barriers to deployment for us, but then for, I think, people broadly, is like we need customer acceptance. People need to want electricity produced by natural gas capturing emissions. If they don't see that and value it, then it's going to be very hard for us to deploy. And a second, I think this applies to us, but to everyone, and as part of the permitting discussion, is social acceptance. We need to have social acceptance for those data centers that get built, for the power lines that get built, for the power plants that get built, whether it's solar or what we're doing. And I was working in wind and solar and battery storage for 12 years. The easy projects are done, if they were ever easy. And our industries, and I say it's a policy issue, but it's a social issue of how do we accept new infrastructure? How do we make sure that infrastructure is actually helpful for local communities? Because if we don't address that, changes in law will just paper over like deeper issues that won't get us to the solution that we need. And we just absolutely agree that on a policy basis, we need more transmission. We need electricity markets that are adapting to the world that has changed. And I say a lot of times that you don't take medicine until you're sick. I think we're getting pretty close to being sick in a few of these markets. And that will hopefully spur some of the changes that I think people have known need to happen, but are just hard to do because of inertia. And we'll need to address those if we're actually going to have a healthy electricity system, ecosystem that can actually get stuff built and deployed.
Thanks. And Christina?
Of course. So permitting. But when I talk permitting, I mean process modernization. Why are we sending physical papers to agencies? Judicial review. Why is it that I'm in litigation for 10 years on a project and I can't get a clear answer on if I'm allowed to keep building something or if I should pull the plug? Streamlining NEPA. Is there a way to maybe make it so you only have to do an environmental review like once, and if there's a problem with it, you just go and fix the problem? I don't know, asking for a friend. Providing certainty. If you're told you have a permit, it would be really great, regardless of an administration, if that permit meant something, and if you've built 90% of a project, you can get it to 100. It's a novel idea. On the other side, on the innovation, and kind of what Charles is mentioning a little bit, is how are we de-risking first-of-a-kind investments? How are we making it so much easier for us to get these really cool nascent technologies built in the United States? It's a lot easier to build it someplace else right now. But if we're able to put in, depends on the technology, but it's an overarching statement. If we're able to make it so that the first-of-a-kind movers have ways to make it so that they don't become giant inflating cost centers, it's a really good way for us to encourage the deployment of the technologies that we're going to need in 10 years. And so thinking about how are we reinvesting in some programs over at the Department of Energy, how are we making it easier for new nuclear fusion, carbon capture technologies, hydrogen, you name it. The first time you build something, you mess up. It's just like building IKEA furniture, but on a much more complicated and scary scale. The second time you get a lot better. The third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 10 times, your skills get a lot better. You know what problems you might be seeing. And so the faster that we're able to make those mistakes and learn from the lessons, that's going to be how we really accelerate innovation. And I will now let you ask more questions.
But if you get that Billy bookcase done right the first time, you feel real good.
And I do.
Yeah.
But it's because I've done many of them and have moved too many times.
Great. Well, let's move to this side of the table. Trina, any policy drivers, policy issues in the next little while that you want to call attention to, and then we can hear from Allison and Lisa as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to be additional to everything that's been said. A couple additional things from a cost perspective. One would be, not propping up technologies that are uneconomic. And so by that, I mean allowing aging and extremely expensive coal plants that were already intended to retire. And so I'm talking about these must-run orders that came out of the administration over the past year. Also allowing cheaper sources of generation that are already under construction to finish construction. So I'm specifically talking about the offshore wind projects that lost a ton of money when they faced stop work orders last year. Allocation of costs. So for power-hungry assets that are attempting to be connected to the grid, ways to accelerate on-site generation for data centers, ways to make sure that data centers are paying their fair share for the benefits of the grid that they're connecting to. So ways to insulate ratepayers and the average, you and me from these large assets. And then the last would be, in a dream world, maybe the incentives that were passed under the Inflation Reduction Act would remain. But in a reality world where many of them have been repealed or phasing out, I would say, stability and predictability and clarity around how to claim what's remaining, and particularly stability around trade barriers.
Great, thanks. Allison, anything you'd like to toss in?
Sure. I mean, I think it's mostly been covered and certainly agree on the permitting reform front. I guess I would just say my big focus has been, and I think will continue to be, affordability. We're doing a lot of meetings with our delegations, talking about rates, and we had LIHEAP Action Day yesterday, which was a big deal. It's a tremendously important program. We hit our whole Southern California delegation. If any of you are from the delegation, we may have seen some of my colleagues yesterday going around and talking about that very important program. We're always trying to make sure that it's fully funded. And it also relates to this whole affordability conversation, of course, relates to data centers and what Trina was saying about, paying their fair share. And, of course, our big concern is just the cost to our ratepayers. If the infrastructure is there, then great. If it's not, then I think it ends up being a little bit more challenging to figure out, and that's something that we're going to all need to do together.
And Lisa, would you like to take us home?
Well, I would just piggyback on some of the comments about innovation and research, development, and deployment, and LIHEAP, the Low Income Heating Assistance Program is just an example. And I just want to thank and commend all of you that worked on appropriations over the past year. You passed bipartisan appropriations bills, and you went through them all for the most part. We still have one that's pending, but I mean, that is historically in the last decade very unusual, and it just shows that when there's an urgency, Congress can act. And so when it comes to the energy sector, just continued funding and clarity from Congress about what it seeks in terms of research, development, deployment, and demonstration is critical.
Thanks. All right. So my colleague Andy has a microphone without a wire attached to it, and she can go anywhere in the room if you'd like to ask a question. Any questions from the audience? All right. All right. Well, while you all are working up some... Was that a question? Okay, it was close to a question. While you all are working up courage to ask questions, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. You all, part of the magic of this panel is that we put it together to cover as much of the fact book as possible. But it is always amazing how much commonality comes across, right? And how the clean energy sector actually works together. I was just curious if anyone had any thoughts about how your industry or how you might recommend to a staff person in the audience who's trying to make sense of this huge energy sector. And any thoughts about how they can help make sense about sort of where different solutions might, pun intended, plug in, or where they might go to find sort of these types of resources, over the course of the year to help people make sense? Obviously the fact book is a huge resource, but any thoughts about how they can make sense of this huge energy system and where you all fit in? Go ahead, Jack. It looked like you were about to say something. Oh, okay. Well, if whoever wants to go first is welcome to.
I can just say that there's a really good guidepost in the fact book. We all looked at this electricity generation slide, but we have that by region. So I guess if it were me starting to understand what matters to my boss with regards to energy, the first place I would go is, what's the energy mix of my state and region? And then I might think about, what kind of businesses are in my state and region, and kind of go backwards from there. Because ultimately, energy policy is geographic, and it's dictated largely by the natural resources that we have in this country, and we are blessed with so many. But when you look at that slide, you quickly see, the western northwest part of the United States, there's a lot of blue, which in this case signals renewables. And what is that? That's hydropower. You might look in the middle of the country, and you see probably a pretty much mirror of what you see at a national level. You see this very diverse set of industry making up the energy generation mix in the middle of the country. I can just go on, but the point is that this shouldn't be a political issue. This really is an issue of economic development and national security for our country. And I think Congress has done a good job of trying to articulate in recent months what it seeks. But I would start by looking at your own generation mix, and you might be surprised at the diversity or things that you just didn't know. And one other thing that it won't show, though, but I thought the slide, and there's a few of them in the fact book that break down state and regional energy efficiency policies and investment. but is what we saw from Chris Young when he brought up the map where you can see where building code adoption is and which states are doing what. So if you compare the supply and the demand side together, I think you'll have a really good picture.
Allison, you want to say something?
I do. Ask me. Ask Sam. Contact whoever your utility company is in the region that you represent. We would be delighted to talk to you. I'd be delighted to talk to you. I'd be excited to introduce you to some of our subject matter experts, and they're willing to sit with you guys and have long conversations about how things work in particular with our utility, how things work in the region. I mean, we're a resource. We're here for you. That's like the point of my job, I feel like, is to be here as a resource for you guys.
And it might be counterintuitive, but you could even help them use less electricity and gas, right?
We are really good at that in California. Lowest use rate.
Go ahead, Charles.
So I'll jump in because I think there's two things that are true. Number one is like and Christopher mentioned this, but the energy that you don't use or that you save is like the cheapest power around, right? So energy efficiency is a really important mechanism for answering this affordability equation. The other part of it too is just because of the aging infrastructure, because of the increased costs of maintenance equipment and everything that is a part of the grid, to keep costs down for residents and households, finding a big energy user like a data center or a new manufacturer is a good way to dampen the cost for across the board, because there's that fixed cost for upgrading your grid, which is a big part of the numerator. But on the denominator side, if you can find large energy users, Amazon is interested in paying the full cost of our power that we're using, and we are a big customer. And so if we can absorb a lot of that cost, it means that it won't be passed along to households and residents. And so that's a major part of our value proposition. Like, we are interested in making the investments in the grid and in the supply side. And there's a study that came out a couple of months ago that illustrated that. And then in some areas, the equation really does work, because we're able to help moderate the electricity increases at worst, and at best, we're able to bring energy prices down just because of the growth and because we're able to absorb a lot of that cost, and we're interested in doing that.
Christina?
Yeah. So in general, if you're trying to get up to speed on energy, it's completely shameless, but CRESS, that's what we do. We educate people on energy, all of the above. If you have a question on the AI hyperscalers, solar, wind, anything, we are happy to do education. We do routine education. So we have one on permitting 101 coming up. And we had one recently that actually talked about regional energy mixes and kind of what different parts of the country need and what they have available based off of unique geography, or, sometimes some parts of the United States just don't have land. If you're trying to just get up to speed on stuff, please come say hi after, and we'll put you into contact with our folks. And we're always happy to help people understand this, because, as I say, no one woke up an energy expert, but it's something that we all use and we should know enough about to be dangerous.
Thanks. Go ahead, Jack, and then Charles will come to you.
Sure. I'll just say there are no silver bullets. There's no one technology approach or company that's going to solve every issue. And that's part of what makes the Business Council, from like a policy recommendation standpoint, but also just like a fleet of technologies, really helpful. And I remember in looking at some of the tables here, going back to 2010, 2011, mercury and air toxic standards were first proposed, and BCSE did a great job of talking about gas, renewables, energy efficiency, demand response, being able to play a role so that the amount of coal generation could come down, reduce hazardous air pollutants, and keep the lights on. Finding those partnerships between technologies is really important. And then from a mentality, there's some great resources. I would also just recommend taking a step back and always thinking about what are you trying to achieve in the public interest? And there's a great book that I got to or had to read through law school called Preside or Lead, which is focused as a guide for utility regulatory commissioners. I think works well for the mentality here too, about taking in information and trying to get a proactive view. So instead of responding to stakeholders saying, I want A, B, and C, and trying to balance it out, having a proactive view of what do you want to achieve, and then how do you use competitive markets and industry players to try to achieve those ends. I think that can be a very helpful mentality, and it's a brilliant book of essays if you're looking for something to read.
Thanks. And Charles B?
I would just say use the resources around you. When I was a congressional staffer, when I had hair and a couple of waist sizes down, I would really nerd out on LIS. What is it called now? I think it's Congress.gov or LIS, that system. You can pull a number of different articles from them. And I'm, as simple as they come, I'm a YouTube University student to this day. So use the resources around you, but also, like everyone has said, please reach out to us. We might not know everything, but we have the resources to give you all the answers that you might have. So please utilize the people around you. Contact, as Allison said, please reach out to your utilities because they also love to give information as well.
I hope you're visiting us on YouTube, Charles. We have all of our briefings up on YouTube.
I have to go back and study my past performances.
I'm a subscriber on YouTube.
Okay, good. That's good. Well, that's great. I think that was super helpful because this is a huge, energy system's enormous and it's complicated and all this stuff has to work together. And if it doesn't, Allison and Sam and others hear about it right away. I'm looking around to see if any, I think we have a question here. Actually we have two. Andy, why don't we start there and then we'll go to the middle.
This is a great event, Dan. Well done again. I was really excited. I work for the National Lab of the Rockies. I was really excited to hear dynamic line rating, reconductoring just gets brought up. So Sam, well done. I'm curious what you think is like if you could pull a policy lever tomorrow and supercharge deployment of whatever grid enhancing technology you think is best. What would that lever be? And yeah, and then conversely, I think what are the technologies that you think are getting close in that space, maybe that you need a little boost for? We're always looking for the next big project. So I don't know who to direct that to. Maybe Sam, you came to mind, but then I realized there are maybe Chris and Allison have thoughts too.
Well, let's give Sam the first go and then everyone else can chime in.
I'll give it a shot. On the latter question, what needs a boost? That's something I would need to go back and talk to my National Grid Partners colleagues about, but that's an excellent question. I am going to take that back. On the first question, how can we get more GETs deployed? This is where there's a sort of a fundamental tension in the system that's difficult to navigate. Is we'll go and we'll propose in a rate case to do a substantial amount of investment that we think will make the grid more flexible. It will, again, create the distributed energy resources, management systems that we need, and edge computing systems to upgrade our substations, dynamic lines that can move power where it needs to be. And then you get people that participate in the system that then accuse us of trying to gold plate and inflate our CapEx numbers so we can make more money. And it gets stripped back and instead we're told, I know all your poles and wires are 100 years old, but just get some spit and glue and keep them running for a little bit longer because nobody can afford what the rest of this looks like. So getting at that state level tension between what is necessary to actually enhance the system, and this is where what Charles was saying around the new large load in the data centers can be really powerful, about growing that denominator and having a large buyer who can actually help finance can be really important because otherwise it becomes really challenging in an affordability constrained environment to get our regulators and communities who otherwise clamor for a modernized grid to actually be willing to say yes to the costs and what that means from a bill perspective. That being said, deferred maintenance is just a future cost that's going to be higher. It's hard to prove out that negative, but we all know it to be true. So we may be reaching something of a breaking point here, but the challenge, I think, tends to be at the state level where you actually have to justify in the rate case what CapEx is actually going to be rate-based through bills.
Great. Go ahead,
I'll jump in on that. because we're talking about utilities and rate cases, and then the issue is that every state is different, every utility's posture and how they're willing to either absorb the cost themselves or find someone external is different. So from Amazon's standpoint, the answer is really easy. The grid enhancing technology that we favor is the one that we can pay for quickly to bring more energy online where we are building. And so it really depends on the locality, but that's where some visibility and some pressure to allow third parties like Amazon to be able to make the investments would really go a long way. The money is there. It's the utility commissions and utilities that need to find the path to be able to access that finance.
Great. Christina?
I'll just make a really good plug for the energy dominance funding. They had an agreement recently with AEP to do some reconductoring work. I want to see more things like that because, if they have a good success story and they're able to show that it's a good way to increase, the delivery of electrons and the reconductoring technology works out, it's going to, number one, increase the scale of the deployment of that technology. When you have, a bigger amount that you're potentially buying, you can get to scale. That means manufacturing is making more of it. And we're kind of like at a point where there's some, grid enhancing technologies that are a bit further on than others. And so what we need to get to is a point where it becomes like the routine practice with utilities. That usually means having a couple that have really good successful projects. And then that helps them in those rate cases because they can go to their commission and say, this utility did it over here. This was the benefit they were able to deliver to customers. This is why this investment is rational. And that's why, when we're talking about, this is probably not necessarily the first of a kind of investment, but it's kind of early stage comparatively to what we've been doing. We need to figure out ways to make it easier for the commissions to say yes. And part of that is using, tools like the EDF.
Other thoughts? Chris, do you have something you'd like to chime in with?
So I had talked about building codes and performance standards, and those are decisions, made at the local and state level, but there are different, federal incentives and support that help states assess and then enforce those codes and standards. So I think that's, an important, it's a piece of the puzzle when we talk, about permitting reform and some other levers that can be pulled. But then there are, also things on the federal level, there's, I briefly mentioned, support for commercial buildings to adopt some of these energy savings technologies. There are things like 179D that have done that. So in the efficiency space, and that's why we're an energy efficiency company. So we think those are important.
Codes. Love those codes. All right. If anyone else has anything they'd like to chime in with, Andy, we had a question here on the aisle in the middle. We started a little late, so this may be our last question, but go ahead.
Thanks. This was a super informative panel. Really grateful for all of your participation. I guess one thing I wanted to ask about was supply chain policy. I think we heard a lot about deployment policies, investment policy. We heard a little bit about supply chain choke points in the gas turbine space, but looking up and down the clean tech value chain, what do you see? Happy if it's like tariffs are priority 1, 2, and 3, but if there are other parts of sort of supply chain policy that you think are really critical on the clean tech side.
That's a great question. Thanks. Charles?
I could just speak on solar modules. I think manufacturing-wise, we have been able to, I think a few years ago, we were number 14 in the United States, in the world, and now we're number 3. So I think that we're continuing to grow domestic manufacturing in all aspects. And I think that, minus the technology, minus the tax credits that we received, we're still seeing a growth in domestic manufacturing through those investments.
Great, thanks. Christina?
Yeah, I love manufacturing questions. So short answer is 45X is an incredible game changer to domestic manufacturing. I think that there's a little bit of a pain point right now with they're called PFE or prohibited foreign entities, commonly referred to as FEOC. Some technologies have what are called tables and some don't. And so for the newer technologies like geothermal, for example, they're going to need additional guidance and, some things to be worked out with Treasury in order to be able to utilize 45X. In terms of things that I'm very excited about, batteries would be a good example. You have pretty substantial investments in the battery supply chain that were triggered from kind of the creation of the 45X tax credit. And so I think, the trends in that area will probably continue. You saw that tariff sheet slide where it talked about just like the amount of money that they're putting on, Chinese imports of batteries. All of these companies need battery storage because it's a really great way to kind of provide flexible power, but also, you are able to store things if it's a lower cost point of day. So battery storage is just going to have a pretty fun future. But I think the cool thing about it is we're looking for domestic availability of the batteries that go into it. And so I think that that's a very cool area. The issue with that is the upstream, obviously. So are we doing domestic mining, extraction, refining? And I think that that's a big focus just overarchingly is how are we able to do more onshoring? Because there's nothing inside of those batteries you couldn't find at size, scale, and spec in the United States. We just need to be able to get it out of the ground and put it through a system. And the United States does tend to do that best. But in terms of like first of a kind deployments for like nuclear reactors and things like that, 45X is probably going to be a pretty incredible thing that can be used in the future. It could even potentially be expanded depending on if we find more choke points, but that's been a pretty substantial driver.
Any other comments on or responses to the question about supply chain? Go ahead, Trina.
I just want to really quickly note where you can find a bit of information on supply chains in the fact book. Page 66 talks about the federal supply chain subsidies, both the ones that were announced under the Inflation Reduction Act and the ones that were since canceled. A lot of that funding does, in fact, remain, but is considered at risk largely because of that PFE or FEOC concern. On page 67, we talk about manufacturing investments made on the private sector side since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. About 10% of that is estimated to have been canceled over the past year, but a significant amount, particularly for batteries, remains. There's also a map of where clean tech manufacturing investment has been planned by state. And I do think it's important to note that it's actually a lot of red states that have a high level of investment in clean tech, particularly for electric vehicle manufacturing throughout the Midwest. And then a lot of solar manufacturing is still concentrated in the South, so Texas and Georgia.
Great, thanks. As we wrap up, I just wanted to give anyone an opportunity. This briefing happens every year at about the same time. Like Trina said, it's a backward-looking resource, so it doesn't try to predict the future. Jack, you talked about clean and firm maybe being the dominant words in the word cloud of 2025. Any predictions for maybe what we'll be talking about next year when we reconvene for the 2027 Sustainable Energy in America Factbook? Any thoughts on the panel? What we might be? Oh, Christina can't resist.
Oh, energy addition, all right? Energy is additive. The only thing we've ever gotten off of is whale blubber. We're going to need a lot of everything, and we're going to need to do it better, faster, and more efficiently. And so I think addition is going to be the hot word next year.
Any other thoughts, predictions? Charles?
I think you had it right in the title of this session. Affordability is going to be front and center. So what we can do to continue to bring costs down for Americans is going to be front and center.
All right. Well, we will go ahead and wrap it there unless there's anyone else that wants to chime in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry we went a couple minutes over, but we also started a couple minutes late, so it comes out in the wash. Thank you to the Business Council for Sustainable Energy for helping us be today. I think BCSE and all of our panelists and BloombergNEF, of course, deserve a big round of applause for everything. And thank you so much. Thanks to our tremendous panelists. Allison, I'll lump you in with the panelists as well, of course. But Charles and Sam and Chris and Jack and Christina, thank you so much for being with us today. Also, thanks again to Representative Tonko's office for help with the room. Thanks to the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Caucuses of the House and the Senate for working with us to spread the word about the briefing, as well as the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. These caucuses are doing really important work to help folks understand everything we talked about today. A lot of the issues we talked about today will actually be back in this room in about 4 months, because that's the date. June 24th is the date for the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Policy Forum Expo and Reception. And that's something we work together on, because you help with that. We work with the House and Senate Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Caucuses on that event. And it is we had hundreds and hundreds of people come through panels similar to this, talking about how different solutions can work together to help us realize the multiple benefits of sustainable energy. So I just wanted to add that plug. I'd also like to thank my EESI colleagues, Dan O and Omri and Allison and Hannah, Anna, Nicole, Laura, and Miguel for all their hard work as well. We also have one of our 2 interns. Apparently Asta had today off. She was traveling, but Andy was with us. Andy, thank you for microphone duty. You did a great job as always. Our interns are really tremendous, and we're really lucky to have Andy and Asta with us this semester. Thanks to Troy in the back for making us look and sound so great. And again, thanks to all of our panelists in the Business Council. While you're taking the survey, hopefully you'll take the survey. It only takes 2 minutes, and we read every response. I'll plug a couple upcoming briefings. Next week on March 3rd is Igniting Innovation, Progress and a Path Forward for Wildfire Policy, and that is being presented with support from the Federation of American Scientists. And on March 12th, if you want to learn more about energy efficiency, come to our briefing called Strategies to Lower Utility Bills Now for Households and Small Businesses. That's going to be a really great one. I think that's even in this room as well. But we have even more than that. Sign up for our Climate Change Solutions biweekly newsletter. It's the best way to keep everything. Thanks, everyone. I guess it rained today. Hopefully the rain has stopped by the time we're walking outside. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to BloombergNEF and to the Business Council for working with us today. I hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday afternoon, and we'll see you hopefully next week for wildfire resilience. Thanks.